Hey everybody, I'm here to talk to you about chapter 10 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. So at the end of chapter 9, I had told you that Frederick had been sent to live with a guy named Mr. Covey, who was considered a master slave breaker because Frederick's current slave owners just couldn't control him. He was unmanageable, he said. So he sent him to this guy that lived in a town named Mr. Covey, who was considered a master slave breaker. This was in January of 1833, Frederick says. He says when he went to the plant, Mr. Covey's to live with him, this is the first time he was put to work as a field hand. He said, keep in mind, he was coming from an environment where he hadn't been whipped too many times. So he said within a week, he had received his first whipping from Mr. Covey. He says it got to the point where he whipped him so bad that he could feel he had blood running down his back, his shoulders, just really punished him. This was after he was sent to take like a team of oxen out in the woods and gather wood or whatever he was doing. I'm not sure, but he really didn't know how to control the oxen. So like, a couple times, like the oxen ran off. He couldn't control them. The wood fell off of the wagon. The cart broke. That type of thing. This happened several times. He ended up taking longer to get back than he was supposed to, than a normal trip should take. So when he got back, he tried to explain to Mr. Covey like what had happened. Hey, I didn't know what I was doing. He says that he then got whipped for that. He said Mr. Covey went to a tree, got some switches off the tree, whipped him severely. He says that oftentimes Mr. Covey would, when he would assign slaves to do work, he would act like he wasn't around. He might act like he was leaving the plantation. He would go somewhere and like sneak up on them. He was sneaking, watching them, catch them by surprise. And so if he caught you like not working, he would whip you. He says that what he did, he got slaves to the point where they were, if he was present or not present, they were so scared to slack off that they never slacked off. So he like got into their heads. He says that, it was a miserable experience. He says that Mr. Covey did succeed in breaking him. He broke his soul, he broke his body, he broke his spirit. He said there were several times where he thought about taking his own life. He talked about where they lived near a bay, and he would see ships. He would see ships like sailing and white people on the ships doing things freely. He would think like, why am I a slave and why are you free? He says he got to the point where at one point he ran away from Mr. Covey's house and ran back to his slave owner's house. When he got back to his slave owner's house, his slave owner was like, what are you doing here? And he's like, you're supposed to be with Mr. Covey for a year. And he says, well, this guy's treating me really bad and he's whipping me. I think he's going to kill me or that type of thing. And he says, nah, he would never do that. Mr. Covey's a good man. I'm instructing you to go back. So in the morning, he got up and he went back to Mr. Covey's home. When he went back, he says, when he heard him coming back, Mr. Covey woke up and came on and met him. He was ready to whip him when he got back. This is where Frederick and Mr. Covey, after he got him back to work, he had him like working this fanning system. And Frederick got to the point where he was like, he got tired of working. He was working with another slave. And Frederick decided to stop working. And when Mr. Covey heard this fanning system stop, he kind of ran down to see what was going on where Frederick and the other slaves were. This is where Covey and Frederick got into a fight. And they went back and forth, he said, for a couple hours because Frederick refused to be whipped. So he says that he believed he got the better of Mr. Covey, left him bloody, left him beat up, that type of thing after a couple hours. He says that he believes this was the turning point of his career because this was the first time like a slave had really stood up to Mr. Covey. And he says that usually slaves who stand up, they're taken to like the middle of the town and they're whipped at the whipping post in front of other slaves and people as an embarrassment, as an example. He says Mr. Covey never did that. He never took him there because he knew that if he admitted that a slave had stood up to him, that would ruin his reputation. So he never did that. He says that he stayed there the rest of the year to around Christmas time, and he was moved. He was talking about Christmas time in the chapter. He was talking about how slaves got usually like that 6 days off around Christmas time. Okay, and he said he felt like this is one of the most masterful things that slave owners did. They gave him this time off, no work. They got him drunk. It was almost like an insult to the master if a slave didn't get drunk. They even had like drinking contests with their slaves, and they made them feel so good that around these 6 days that it almost erased all the bad punishment they had the rest of the year. So like this kind of like played mind games with them. He says that he talked about religious slave owners. He said that he thought they were the worst slave owners. He also talked about in this chapter how he started like a Sabbath school. He started to teach other slaves how to read, and how great this felt to be teaching other slaves how to read. During this chapter, he started to formulate with other slaves who started to feel the same way he did about escaping, about being free, started to formulate their first slave escape plan of escape. They started to put this together as a group. They had the way they were going to do it all planned out. It was stopped because someone they believed was an informant and told the slave owners. Ended up that Frederick was sent back to Baltimore, where he was taught a trade. He worked as a caulker and a slave in a shipyard. So in a shipyard with a bunch of men there building ships, he worked as a caulker. During this time, he talked about how he fought sometimes with the men in the shipyard because they would be treating him very mean, treating him very nasty, calling him the N-word, that type of thing, treating him like he was an animal. So that's kind of like what this chapter was about, chapter 10. The big, huge event was the fight and with the slave breaker, Mr. Covey, and how Frederick says this was the end of his career as a slave and kind of like set him on that path to like, hey, I'm going to be free one day. So this was chapter 10 of the narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass.